Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Onyegoldu. Now, a military funeral has been held in Cairo for the former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, who died on Tuesday at the age of 91. Mr. Mubarak ruled Egypt for 30 years until he was deposed in an uprising in 2011. He'd been in ill health for many years. His legacy remains divisive within Egypt, with dozens of his supporters holding his pictures and expressing gratitude to the man they called Egypt's greatest leader, who they say managed to keep the country stable for 3 decades. However, it's a view not shared by many Egyptians who took part in the 2011 uprising, who see Mr. Mubarak as a dictator. And many of them are angry that he's been given such a huge farewell in Cairo. Well, in a moment, we'll examine the divisive legacy of Hosni Mubarak. But first, here are some highlights from Mr. Mubarak's state funeral. Funeral there of Hosni Mubarak. Well, for more on the former president and his divisive legacy, I'm joined now from our London studios by the African Affairs analyst Lagun Akinloye, and here in the Abuja studio by Dr. Chudi Uwazurike, Professor of International Relations and Sociology and founder of African Profiles USA and Globe magazine. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. Let me just go to London first and start with you, Lagun. The authorities in Egypt holding a full state funeral for the former president, a huge farewell to the country's longest serving president, attended by the country's current president, Fattah al-Sisi. What's your reaction to all that?
We cannot deny that Hosni Mubarak was a behemoth on the Egyptian stage, on the Middle East stage, on the global stage. For 30 years, he held a tight reign over Egypt. And to be accorded such respect, the military, who he was a big part of, have done it on his accord. Many of his underlings are still in places of power, and they are celebrating the departure of their leader, pretty much.
Okay, stay with us. Let me bring Professor Uwazurike in. Quite a lot of people, as Lagun pointed out there, turned up at the funeral expressing their love for him and their gratitude to him. What was it about him that some people found so special? Not all people, but some people.
Well, yeah, you have to go back to some sort of historical perspective. He was the fourth president after General Negri, General Nasser, and General Sadat, and so on, since 1953, for instance. The year 53 is interesting because that was when Egypt regained its own independence from Britain, more or less. And that was the first time in 2,500 years that a native Egyptian had actually handled Egypt. Egypt has a long history of conquest from the Romans, the Greeks, and all, including the Arabs, as a matter of fact. But direct to your question as to why some are celebrating him, I think there are two answers here. One is the climate of fear that General al-Sisi, the current leader, has instituted, with thousands of people being arrested, hundreds of death row and so on. People are now comparing this with maybe the autocratic, but not so terribly violent regime of Mubarak. So there's nostalgia in a way. And I will also say that, as Lago has indicated, he was there for 30 years. And there's no question that from that period to when he left, he established a different track than the more revolutionary, more upheaval oriented regimes of General Nasser. And I think that's what people are reacting to, in my view.
Right, okay. I'll come back to you in a minute, but let me go to London and Lagun, because of course, you pointed out those who admire him, but of course many others disagree. They see him as a corrupt dictator who did not deserve such a huge farewell, certainly not a state funeral.
It cannot be hidden that under the reign of Mubarak, the economy was captured by oligarchs and businessmen and family members, and even though the economy grew under Mubarak, the poorer got worse, and the people did not actually see the benefits of the government and the investment and all that was required for Egypt. Therefore, you look at the ones who were benefiting from it, it was a clique. So the majority of Egyptians are right to make noise, because ask the average man on the street, how was Egypt under Mubarak? The wealthy man will say it was okay, we were stable. The poor man will say they have not witnessed or seen any difference in their lives, and if not, it will get worse. But people say that he created stability. We overestimate or underestimate what stability really is. Egypt is a country where people are very varied. The stability that he created was great for the Middle East and for Egypt itself, really.
Let me piggyback on that.
Yes, of course, please.
In addition to your question as to
Yes.
why he's been missed. You know, he was a war hero during the Cold War.
Yes, he was, actually.
Yes, he was a commander of the Air Force. And that was the Air Force that managed to push back, however temporarily, the Israeli forces from the Suez Canal and so on. That was a big deal, even though Israel ended up triumphing in the end and so on. But the mere fact that they had that early triumph compared to what happened during the Six-Day War, when they were still asleep and the whole Air Force was destroyed. That stood him out. That's really part of his career recognition that should not be taken away. I think that's also part of the...
No, that's a very good point. And you also made an interesting point earlier, because of course he was overthrown at that pivotal moment in the Arab Spring in 2011. Yes. But the current government in Egypt, which has links to his past, I mean, is the country that different now? I know you touched on this earlier, because quite a lot of people actually think that the country is far worse now in terms of the economy and in terms of the suppression of human rights.
Yeah, because as Lagos said, not much has really changed. In other words, you had an autocratic but benign regime, and then you have a more autocratic regime now that basically came to power on the wings of the people's expectations, but basically is a militarized kind of entity that we have right now. I think the time has come, as speaking now as a Pan-Africanist, when very clearly we have to understand in this part of the world, in Africa, that there's no substitute to democracy. We've tried all kinds of things you can think of. We've tried the Haile Selassie model, we've tried the Idi Amin model, we've tried all kinds of stupid, far worse these things. And Al-Sisi came in at the time when the Egyptians had intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually, as a matter of fact, were ready for a regime of give and take, a regime of free speech, free association. And what do you get? You know, the secret services are back again. The spies all over the place, and people are just being brutalized. And that's not what they want. I don't think the average Egyptian is happy today. The Arab Spring was a very incredible moment when the entire Middle East...
But of course it fizzled away.
Because one by one the autocrats got control back. So it's really part of the democratic struggle of the continent that was still not there. Even in our own country, no. I don't know how a poor man can feel free in a democracy. You need a middle class type of strategy, as it were. And that's what we still are missing.
That's a very good point. And just returning to you in London, Lagoon, I mean, you just remind us, if you will, how Hosni Mubarak came to power. It was after the assassination of Anwar Sadat by Islamist extremists in 1981, wasn't it?
Hosni Mubarak was actually next to Sadat when the bomb went off in the parade ground. He was Sadat's number two, his successor, the one who Sadat trusted a lot. His rise to power was as a leading member of the military group and the elite in that part. Therefore, he knows the system. He was part of the system. He was also an individual who moved away from the Russian-Soviet part of it, which was a well-known move by Gamal Abdel Nasser, moved away from Russia and went more towards America, even went more towards Israel in terms of the detente and to create a partnership with them. His politics were interesting, but at the end of the day, the corruption level was still high. His two sons and the people who were involved in that, they were called out eventually.
Yes, and of course his two sons were at that funeral. today. They were marching with President al-Sisi. But Professor Uwazurike, just to follow up on what Lagun was saying there, in terms of foreign policy, he was a key ally of the West, wasn't he? Maintaining the peace deal with Israel, which sometimes drew the ire of other countries in the Middle East.
Yes. In terms of foreign policy, I find him rather interesting. He really touched on all the four corners of his country's foreign policy in a very stout way. You know, he was actually an avid OAU member. Very much into the African Union. Somebody was president, I think, or chairman of the OAU, if I remember, when he came to Egyptstown. He came to meetings. One of those meetings in Ethiopia, he was almost assassinated at the airport and then turned right back and so on. So he never really gave up on his African connection. But there's no question that he is to be located in terms of the Israeli-Arab conflict and Arab politics generally.
In other words, he threw in his towel more with Israel and with the West. And in some ways, some have argued that that's what helped keep him in power.
Yes.
I mean, he was getting a lot of money from the Americans.
Yes, a lot. That's what to the tune of billions.
Yes.
Were being written up by the West and so on. Some may call him a Western puppet, but he's a survivor in the kind of Byzantine politics of the region.
That's a very interesting.
I mean,
that's a very interesting definition.
I go back all the way to Roman times, to Cleopatra, about 30 BC, for instance. No Egyptian ruler had been ever able to survive without some sort of international coalition, given the geography of the land, as it were, from Julius Caesar to Napoleon.
Because, of course, the Cleopatra was kept there by the Macedonians, wasn't she?
No, by Julius Caesar.
Well, Julius Caesar, she was actually originally a Macedonian,
That's
I think, herself.
Her descent was from Alexander the Great's line. You're right.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So they've had that situation, and there's no question. But, Egypt is a power. And there's, no matter how angry you are with Egypt, and we saw this during the Nasser days, we saw this during the Sadat days. Sadat was simply the most difficult because he was the one who signed the peace deal, for instance, which Mubarak ended up maintaining. The others were angry, but you can't do without Egypt.
Well,
Egypt really is a master in how to use his position to exert power.
We're going to come back and talk some more about this. Stay with us. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat about the divisive legacy of the former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak, whose funeral took place earlier in the day. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, as you may know, a military funeral has been held for the former Egyptian leader Hosni Mubarak. Mr. Mubarak was laid to rest in Cairo after dying at the age of 91. The current president, Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, walked alongside Mubarak's sons in a procession behind his coffin as it was taken to the Field Marshal Tantawi Mosque in Cairo. Mr. Mubarak ruled Egypt for 3 decades after being forced from office during the protests that engulfed the Arab world back in 2011. He was tried and found guilty of complicity in the killings of protesters during the uprising. He won the right, though, to a retrial, at the end of which the charges were dropped and he was freed in 2017. There's been a muted international response to Mr. Mubarak's passing, but the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu spoke rather well of him.
On behalf of the people of Israel and the Israeli government, I wish to express deep sorrow over the death of President Hosni Mubarak. President Mubarak, a personal friend of mine, was a leader that led his people to peace and security, to peace with Israel. I met with him many times and I was impressed with his commitment, and we will continue to walk this joint path. I wish to send condolences to President el-Sisi and the Mubarak family and the Egyptian people.
And with me from our London studios, the African Affairs analyst Lagun Akinloye, and here in the Abuja studio, Dr. Chudi Uwazurike, Professor of International Relations and Sociology and founder of African Profiles, USA and Globe magazines. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to come to you, Lagun, in a moment, but let me ask you this, Professor Uwazurike, because of course, I mean, we heard Benjamin Netanyahu there. speaking rather well of Hosni Mubarak. But back home, Mubarak was the typical strong man, wasn't he? Throughout his rule, he maintained emergency laws, giving the security forces sweeping powers of arrest, which of course meant that discontent was never far from the surface.
Yes, and his response was also typical of third world dictators. He was an autocrat, ruled. He maintained the security state with a lot of intelligence partners as well as outfits and so on. Nothing to admire there in this day of democracy. But remember that he came to power during the Cold War. I think it's very important never to really ever take away our gaze from the impact of the Cold War. The Cold War era was a totally different era altogether. He came to power in the middle of tensions with Israel, obviously, which implied tensions with the US, and Egypt had to make a choice whether to ally with Russia, his long-term partner, or whether to fall for the enticements of the West and so on. And he tried to play it in the middle. But even though, he was trained in the Soviet Union and actually spoke Russian and so on, clearly had some cultural understanding of that particular place. But there's no question that he was a dictator. I would call him a benign dictator, and I put that in quotes, likely because for all those who suffered under him and so on, they find nothing benign.
Of course, yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
So benign dictator sometimes.
Sometimes.
Until you get me really angry, then I turn into a different type of dictator.
That's who he is.
But let me go to London and Lagun Akinloye, because of course, in 2011, I think we touched on that earlier, Egyptians were inspired by the uprising in Tunisia, and they took to the streets. I mean, Mr. Mubarak desperately clung to power for like 3 weeks or so, making concessions and defending his regime, but that didn't work, did it?
Rightly so. The people of Egypt had a right to vent out their anger and put out their frustration and put an end to the 30 years of autocratic rule at the end of the day. And you're right, they were inspired by the movement going around that region. And the military did not step in for Mubarak. They put it aside and let him step down and gave him not a smooth landing, but not as harsh as we would have liked for him personally. Nevertheless, you look at Egypt now, and have they made progress past that? Have they gone past the time of the Mubarak? People will say no, that Egypt has not got better, which is the main question. What do they prefer? 30 years under a man who held the reins of power and who was autocrat, but who witnessed economic development and some form of progress, or now where women's rights are at all-time low, democracy is just not a thing anymore. The general feeling of people in Egypt who I've spoken to is one of despair and anger. Therefore, that's why people are a bit nostalgic about Mubarak, because they are harking back to the days of, where there was some kind of prosperity, where there was stability. Therefore, we hope for a better Egypt for tomorrow, really.
Yes, no, absolutely. And Professor Wazirike, of course, he eventually, was forced to step aside. That led to his trial. He had become a visibly reduced man, but of course, his conviction was eventually overturned. He was freed after sort of serving, I think, a number of years for embezzling public funds. I mean, but for a man who had wielded tremendous power for 3 decades and was seen by some as a sort of latter-day pharaoh, would you say that it's been a humiliating end for Hosni Mubarak?
Oh, a most humiliating end. He fell into the tragedy that is so typical in African politics of never grooming a successor, of never knowing when to step down, and of never acknowledging his own defects, as it were. It's like the rest of them riding the back of a tiger. Once they mount, they can't dismount any further. And I consider him a tragic hero. There's no question that there were moments when he should have considered stepping down. He was already in his 80s. It baffles me in the case of Cameroon and so many of the octogenarians that taught Africa why these people persist in wanting to die in power. In his own case, he was dragged more or less to retirement and humiliated along the way. So it was a very bad end, I would say. You can see that in the tributes to him during the military, they were mostly focused on the Yom Kippur War, his role as commander of the Air Force and so on. Not so much his role as a president. But one thing we also need to understand in a way is that the ruling clique in Egypt, as we see in many other places, is dependent on some of this international support for their own survival. The real problem in Israel, as you can imagine, is the battle between the Muslim Brotherhood and then those opposed to them.
Yeah, the problem in Egypt.
Yeah,
you
the
mean,
Mohammed
yeah.
Morsi group, for instance. Mohammed Morsi, his successor, who died in very, very appalling conditions, as it were. They've always been afraid that it's almost like one election, one time, and it's over. The whole notion that once the Muslim Brotherhood came to power, there would be no further elections. And
even though they were democratically elected.
Even though they were democratically elected, but they won't hold elections anymore.
Right.
So very clearly there were blunders. And I think that is also, if you see in the track being followed by Al-Sisi and the rest, you can see that playing out. They just can't tolerate for the life of them any of the radicals coming to power because they know they'll be wiped out. So the situation is a little dicey.
Right. Okay, Lagun, I'm going to get you to put on your Nigerian analyst's hat, because I mean, just listening to Professor Wazirike there, he was talking about the fact that you've got this sort of practice of dictators entrenching themselves in places like Egypt. But I mean, Nigeria has managed to escape that, hasn't it? I mean, there really hasn't been a dictator, certainly during the time of military dictatorships, who spent more than 10 years in office in this country. So it always seemed to fit into the two-term sort of...
That actually is extremely true. And Nigeria should be very proud of the progress that it has made in terms of democracy. And even though things are unstable on the ground in Nigeria, you can say that, yes, democracy is taking root. And people must ask why it's not taking root in Egypt. Why Egypt, the bastion of the Middle East, the largest country in the region, has not adhered to the values of democracy. They should, for once, take note from Nigeria and learn from consistent elections, because the will of the people must prevail. The one man, one vote aspect of things is very important in terms of the progress in democracy, the progress in the economy, the ability for the man to actually put his vote forward. You had Mubarak for 30 years. Al-Sisi now has no plan for the country in terms of elections or restoring the democracy, and things can only take root and get better once democracy sits in, really.
And we've got just about a minute left, Dr. Wazirike, but I mean, looking at Egypt and the way that it is positioned, it could easily lean in the direction of sub-Saharan Africa, where you've got quite a few democracies thriving, because if it looks the other way towards the Middle East, you tend to see more dictatorships and more sort of monarchies that are unconstitutional, briefly.
Yes. Well, yeah, that's interesting, largely because I think we've made progress. I agree with Lago. I mean, sometimes, we tend to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and I'll say very clearly that in some respects, the evolution of political parties, but far more importantly, the judiciary. We've not done as well as we can. Without the judiciary, as you see with all the difficulties of cases of review and reversals going on right now, unless we get that right, our democracy will also be impaired.
Okay.
That's the problem.
Professor Chidi Uwazirike in Abuja and Lagun Akunleye in London, thank you very much indeed. That's it for this edition of the Arise interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja and London, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.